We come this morning to the fourth of the studies that we've been doing over recent weeks on what are known as the penitential psalms. These are songs that were written many hundreds of years ago. They were written by people who felt conscious of their sin, aware of their failure, burdened by their guilt. And these songs especially address people who find themselves in that situation, perhaps also conscious that they are strangers to God, conscious that He is angry with them. So we come to Psalm 32, the psalm that Colin just read for us. I have known those periods in life, as I'm sure most of you have, when the pressures of life have been such that we can identify with what the psalmist writes here. My bones wasted away through my groaning all day long. And has commented that sometimes the absence of love can actually have a crippling effect upon a person's life. And we've known those experiences, I think many of us, when we find it difficult even to summon up the energy to eat because of the pressures we're under. Or perhaps if you're me, when you're in that situation you eat too much. But whichever way it is, we know the experience that David is speaking of here, of our strength being sapped as in the heat of summer. I'm constantly amazed in my own life when I have one of my good days and I suddenly find energy that I didn't think I had. On my bad days, the energy's not there. On the good days, then there is energy and to spend. And I suspect many of us know that too. But those experiences which may come simply because of the range of our experiences of life may especially come when we feel that we have failed. We may be conscious that we've failed ourselves. We set ourselves standards and we've blown them. We've been conscious of the way in which we've failed other people, and that is something that is deeply disturbing and painful to us. Perhaps we're dimly aware sometimes that we've also failed God Himself. The Bible speaks of that, especially when with reference to God, as conviction of sin. And it can be an extremely painful business. David knew that, and he wrote this psalm to encourage us to discover what he himself had discovered. To start off with, he was not willing to do anything about it. He kept silent. He gritted his teeth. He battled through, because he did not want to face the reality of his situation. But at length it's almost as though the Lord twisted his arm up his back to the point where David had to cry for mercy. And so he did. And he tells us what happened. The first thing he says is this: the medicine that applied to my need was a painful one. He was forced to admit he was wrong. Then I acknowledged my sin. There's almost a sense of, then I acknowledged my sin. It was through gritted teeth. It was painful. I remember some years ago a colleague coming to see me, as periodically this particular colleague did tell me off, and to say, you know, Stephen, I've never ever heard you say sorry. To my knowledge, even as he said it to me, I could recall at least 3 occasions in which I had used that little 5-letter word with reference to this person. What I actually could have said was, I've never heard you use it. I recall using it myself, but I never ever have heard you use it. I was thinking this morning, the word horse, it's a 5-letter word, isn't it? Horse, it actually comes in our passage here. horse. Now, if I were to say to you, say horse, you would all come back and say it without any difficulty at all. But if I were to say there's another 5-letter word, begins with S and ends with Y, now say that. Sorry. That's far more difficult, isn't it? To say horse is easy. It doesn't cost us anything. To say sorry is extremely painful. It hurts. It says something about myself. I'm having to admit that I have failed. I've done something wrong. Sorry is a humbling word. It's a painful word to use. And some people just simply can't say it. That's true of some of us, frankly. We can't use the word sorry, or at least if we use it, we don't actually mean it. I think of others who, when they have been convinced of their wrong, have not used the word sorry, but have said, well, let's move on then. Don't acknowledge their personal guilt. Well, let's dust it all under the cup. That's all in the past now, isn't it? Let's move forward together. But the little word S-O-R-R-Y never comes out their lips. David discovered that he had to use that word. And he had to go to God and say, sorry. And that hurt. It was dragged out of him with the pain and anguish of extracting a tooth. But he said sorry. And he recognized his failure for what it actually was. In verses 1 and 2, there are 3 different words for sin that are used. There's the word for sin, which means sin in its breadth. There's the word translated secondly sin here, but actually more accurately should be iniquity, which is sin in its depth. And there is the word transgression, which is to fail to meet the mark that God sets. Sin in its breadth, its depth, and its in failure to honour God. These 3 words together embrace all that sin is. But David came to the point of recognizing that each of those things was true of him. Not only was he forced to the point of saying sorry, but he was forced to the point, or he was brought to the point of recognizing the reality of his condition. He faced up to it fair and square. It hurt. Ouch! But he didn't try to evade the truth. And at that point, perhaps for some of us, I could conclude my message. Because actually, for some of us, that's what we need to hear. The rest of what I have to say is not yet ready to be said to you or to me. We've got to first of all acknowledge that we have sinned against one another and against God. But humbling though those steps were for David, David in this psalm is primarily less concerned to tell us of the pain and anguish of sin, but the fruits of what he found when he said that 5-letter word to God, sorry. Blessed, oh, how to be envied, he says, is the person whose transgressions are forgiven, whose sins are covered, whose sin the Lord does not count against him. When he said sorry, that's what he discovered. He discovered he was forgiven. One of the most powerful experiences in my life was when I turned to a well-known Christian leader whom I knew but vaguely and said to him, sorry. I realized that I'd failed this particular man. And he turned to me, and his wife was sitting with him. She started crying, but he said to me, it's forgiven and forgotten. And that's what God does to us. that burden of sin, that sense that we need to be forgiven, is granted to us by God himself. His guilt was removed. I acknowledged my sin to you and did not cover up my iniquity. I said, I will confess my transgressions to the Lord, and you forgave the guilt of my sin. That doesn't mean we don't feel remorse for our failure, but we know